So obviously, you mentioned before, Biden was criticized for having this overseas trip, and so he kind of truncated it. He kept on schedule going to Japan for the G7 meeting, as you mentioned, but he was supposed to also visit my home country of Australia as well as my neighbour Papua New Guinea. And so those two stops were sort of nixed from the agenda. One, because of this debt ceiling concern. And it's sort of a funny argument that the White House is trying to make, because they always argue, particularly when he goes to Delaware for the weekend, that he can be president anywhere.
Right.
But as all of a sudden now he's integral to these negotiations, which, you know, for the most part have actually only been staff to staff. So it's just a funny optical illusion domestically.
Welcome to Reporter's Notebook, where we talk to the Washington Examiner's top journalists about the stories breaking on their beats. I'm Jim Antle. I'm joined today by White House reporter Naomi Lim. Naomi, it's really getting to be crunch time with President Biden, the debt ceiling negotiations, sort of interrupting his trip a little bit. Talk about, you know, these things are fast changing, but talk a little bit about what the current dynamic is.
So you're right, the clock is ticking. We have only a couple of weeks left before the Treasury Department can no longer pay the country's bills. I think we're seeing...
I mean, when you put it like that, it sounds like kind of a problem.
It's a bit of an issue. And it's interesting because when we've had White House negotiations in the past, the White House has come out being more optimistic than House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. But we're seeing a slight change in his rhetoric, which I think is sort of because he has notched two main political wins. One, the White House is negotiating, even though they don't like using that term.
Right.
And then two, he's actually gotten a win in terms of who is negotiating. So he's sort of, it's him and his team and the White House, as opposed to having other Democratic leaders and Republican leaders involved in the conversation. And what we're sort of seeing is a framework that is emerging that sort of has four areas: capping federal spending, sort of clawing back COVID funds, changes to work requirements and changes to permitting reform, which is sort of a big win for Republicans, even though some House Republicans don't think it goes far enough.
Sure.
The other thing is, though, is the problem for Biden is that he's also facing opposition for some more progressive or more liberal members of his own conferences on the Hill, because they are a little bit worried about the permitting reforms and also the work requirement portion of it. So progress has been made, but I still think there's like a little bit more to go.
Everything you do to get maybe some Republicans on board risks alienating the more liberal Democrats. Anything you do to satisfy the more liberal Democrats risks alienating Freedom Caucus, the more conservative Republicans.
Exactly. It's a really sort of tricky needle that they're trying to thread. But I think that there was sort of a talk from the previous meeting where there's more agreement around a bipartisan bill, which I think kind of negates the problem that you're just speaking about.
Sure. So not only is this of interest to a domestic audience, but obviously international leaders are watching this. President Biden will, by the time people are seeing this, have returned, but he had a major overseas trip. Talk a little bit about concerns that, number one, this doesn't look good while he's negotiating with the Group of Seven, and two, you know, how the international community might view the potential of default.
I mean, this is kind of one of the reasons why I wouldn't personally be a politician, because you will upset somebody either way.
I'd vote for it.
Oh, well, thank you. So obviously, you mentioned before, Biden was criticized for having this overseas trip, and so he kind of truncated it. He kept on schedule going to Japan for the G7 meeting, as you mentioned, but he was supposed to also visit my home country of Australia as well as my neighbour Papua New Guinea. And so those two stops were sort of nixed from the agenda. One, because of this debt ceiling concern. And it's sort of a funny argument that the White House is trying to make, because they always argue, particularly when he goes to Delaware for the weekend, that he can be president anywhere.
Right.
But as all of a sudden now he's integral to these negotiations, which, you know, for the most part have actually only been staff to staff. So it's just a funny optical illusion domestically. In terms of the foreign politics, I mean, he has to go into this G7 meeting is falling at a really critical time. One, not only because of the war in Ukraine militarily, but also geopolitically, that Biden is trying to sort of realign alliances to have a more forceful posture towards, you know, China and things like that. But the question that, you know, will come up and bubble up among all of the summits and his side meetings will be about the prospect of a default, because the US economy is so integral to the global economy.
Sure.
He was sort of shouted questions out during his first sideline meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister. He ignored them. But something that we're seeing, the messaging from the White House is sort of like, well, this problem, we wouldn't be in this situation but for the Republicans. So that's another interesting thing that's happening over there too.
So while all of this is going on, he also has to run for re-election, and he seems to be collecting more potential Republican opponents. Is the spotlight on him, or is it really on the Republicans at this point?
I feel like it's go time for the Republican side of things. I think we're really heating up, and we're going to see the primary field expand. We're seeing reports that Ron DeSantis, the governor from Florida, is about to file, paperwork to do that, and then do a formal announcement in his hometown, in the coming days. And so that, I think, will really kickstart the Republican side of the action, just because DeSantis is the closest polling opponent to a former President Donald Trump. And so I think that's when we'll start things going. And then obviously we've got Tim Scott, the senator from South Carolina, sort of hinting towards his own announcement. And I think Mike Pence, the former vice president, also is in the same boat. And so I think that while Biden has the advantage of having the bully pulpit, I think the message that he will be drumming out will be a little bit muted as the Republican field takes shape.
Should the Republicans go to Australia since Biden didn't?
I mean, always welcome.
Thank you, Naomi. You can read Naomi and the rest of our political team's coverage at washingtonexaminer.com.